made a little rap. For you guys. Nah, I'm just kidding. But that beat's pretty dope. Hey, yeah, you. Are you struggling to become a better reader and writer? Then come on down to UIC and take English 160. In this delightful course, you'll learn how to become a better reader and writer. English 160 is one of the first classes everyone must take, and it's evident why. This class will help you understand everything better. Well, not everything, but you'll be able to read and write more effectively for every other class you take. Not only will you be expected to read and write in this class, but you'll also have to participate. I know, right? Shocker. Trust me, it's more fun if you participate. If you're lucky enough to choose Professor Clark's English 160 class, you'll get awesome feedback on anything you turn in. Also, Professor Clark has a tendency to love open discussions, and I think that's pretty cool. Whether it's discussing literature or debating answers, it's hard not to get involved because talking is part of the fun. And if you don't like to talk, Professor Clark might just pick you because you don't speak much. The more the merrier. English 160's goals are to demonstrate rhetorical awareness of the audience through different genre-based assignments, read texts in a variety of disciplines and genres, using reading strategies, draw connections at the ideas across multiple texts, defend a position in relation to the range of ideas surrounding a topic, demonstrate knowledge of writing as a process, including consideration of peer and instructor feedback, from initial draft to final draft revision, and to demonstrate sentence level correctness. Moving along, our first assignment was the abstract. The abstract was focused on the Singer's Solution to World Poverty by Peter Singer. We had to summarize the main points of Singer's argument without inserting any opinion/bias. Condensing the 5-page article into 2 pages isn't the easiest task in the world. Surprisingly enough, I started the assignment thinking it was fairly simple, but when I received my second draft back from the instructor, it was obvious I was wrong. I just want to note that no one's writing is perfect. If you receive a draft back with the whole thing marked up, do not worry. If anything, that's a good thing. I appreciate suggestions and scrutiny because it will help me improve for my final draft. And if you feel truly stuck, you'll always have your peers and professor to speak to. Okay, moving on to our second assignment. The next one was the speech. For this speech, we discussed whether America was just or not. We had to persuade our audience to agree with our views by using rhetorical devices. This essay is really meant to bring out the passion one has in their hearts and put it on paper. Also, beforehand, you will be taught multiple ways to effectively write in order to make your audience believe in what you have to say. I was in awe at the various rhetorical devices there were. For example, the main appeals such as ethos, logos, and pathos, then devices like antithesis, apostrophe, chiasm. Furthermore, our third assignment was the argumentative essay. In this essay, we argued what is the greatest threat to social/economic justice in Chicago. By using recent scholarly and popular sources, we are meant to effectively convey our argument to our audience. You must support your argument by using evidence and counter-arguments while citing everything perfectly. This is the most formal and professional paper of all. As I mentioned earlier, it's impossible to write a perfect essay on your first go. Everyone faces problems when they write. I'll admit that I thought I was a pretty good writer before this class, but this class taught me things that I never thought about when I wrote a paper. So, I'm here to tell you my writing
problems and how I overcame them. To begin,
I noticed early on that when I wrote, I couldn't make sense of it a day later. I'm not sure how to describe it, but I'd look back at my work and think, what was I writing? It hit me when I got my second draft of my abstract reviewed by Professor Clark. The overall concept of an abstract seemed very simplistic, but in reality it wasn't. When Professor Clark reviewed mine, my whole abstract had comments and marks everywhere. I realized that when I wrote a paper, I just wrote off the top of my head, and I was able to understand what it meant, but others would be lost with my wording and sentence structures. And I would get confused too. For example, Singer uses the film Central Station in order to convey the wrongness of a fortunate lifestyle. What does that even mean? So, in order to overcome my problem, I read and revised every single suggestion from my edit. I also noted that having multiple people read your paper is good because they're going to be able to offer feedback that any writer should accept. On another note, especially for abstracts, one should write with the idea that the reader knows nothing about what you're talking about. With that in mind, you should be able to write more clearly for people to understand your work. You have to write with clarity. I ended up fixing that quote into this. To begin, Singer discusses the film Central Station to convey that Americans are allowing children to suffer by not donating. Another confusing quote I had was, not to mention that the car is Bob's life savings and the child is just a child. I had to completely restructure the sentence into a more simple, clear, and concise sentence. Then I got this. Lo and behold, a train hurtles down the track with no way to stop it. Bob realizes that there's a child on the track who is going to be killed by the train. I used to think that writing had to be complex and philosophical, but I learned throughout the course that it should be the exact opposite, clear and simple. Get your point across writing is crucial for any good paper. Moreover, I had a bit of a problem with introductions as well. Honestly, I was atrocious at writing intros at first. For some reason, I thought that I had to write the whole intro first, then write the bodies, but that's not the case. For example, here's a poor intro that I wrote for my first draft of the argumentative essay. Chicago is a city that is idolized from around the world. Some may view it as beautiful city as the towers scrape the sky, but the realist may see a deeper issue that lies in the heart of Chicago. Education is one of the biggest issues when it comes to equality. Economic justice in Chicago is mainly threatened by CPS, school closings, and lack of funding for public education in the city, which lead to increasing poverty, gang violence, and wealth disparities. This cliche and very specific intro didn't help me at all. Professor Clark actually made me read that out loud, and I was kind of embarrassed because he had just said a second before that he's read thousands of papers that start with how beautiful Chicago is. So learn from my mistake. Instead of being basic, you should write different, engaging introductions. One way that works well is to say a fact or a question that's meant to wow the reader. Or you can tell an anecdote, basically anything to engage your reader, to make them want to read more. Also note that you should always leave your intros for last. Surprisingly, it will allow you to just summarize what you ended up writing, and it'll be way easier. So my intro changed a lot, almost a complete restructure. How is it possible that 75% of students in Chicago's lowest performing public elementary schools failed to meet standards on the ISAT, which measures basic math and reading skills? Chicago public schools have exactly a certain amount of students, while only a certain amount of the students are in high school. Servicing over 500 schools, Hispanic and African Americans make up 83.8% of the overall demographic, and most tend to come from lower income households. CPS is increasing the educational inequality gap by not providing families with proper education for their children. Chicago is a city that is idolized from around the world, yet public schooling system constantly closes budgets and cuts schools. Education is one of the greatest contributors to equality, but a lack of access to proper education impedes the success of a society. Economic and social justice in Chicago is mainly threatened by Chicago public school closings and the substandard education standards. As you can tell, I didn't specify anything too much or too little. I introduced facts about my main topic just to inform the readers. You have to have a broad enough intro to allow you to write about as much as you want, but not too broad because that can weaken your argument. Moving along to conclusions, gosh, I love them. I've always struggled with conclusions. I would read other people's and be so confused as to why theirs sounded amazing compared to mine. For example, Chicago may one day be a great, beautiful city where everyone loves each other and is happy. But for that dream to even be possible, the city must start from the roots of its future. By giving its children a fair and equal education, Chicago can save itself out of a crisis and may one day live happily. Yes, sadly, this was my first draft conclusion to the argumentative essay. Later on, we were taught how to write conclusions in an effective manner. It is somewhat important to restate your thesis, but you should always for sure mention something about how your paper is important. Also, it's crucial that you leave the readers with something to think about after they finish reading the papers. Basically, finish as strong as possible. Then I finished off with this. In conclusion, CPS continues to fail its students immensely. By providing a substandard education to the youth of Chicago, it is impossible to find an equilibrium in the future of the city. CPS is the greatest threat to Chicago's social justice. A constant school closings in poor neighborhoods will only ensure that they stay poor. A student should not have to struggle to attend high school, yet that is what CPS puts its students through daily. CPS claims that they're fighting for the well-being of the students, but all research suggests otherwise. CPS must aid poor-performing schools instead of shutting them down. In order for Chicago to have social and economic justice, you must start at the root of the problem, an inadequate education system. I definitely improved by making my final statements as clear and as strong as possible. I feel that this is one of the best conclusions I've written in my life. I'd recommend not to insert wishy-washy writing. No one cares about that in an argumentative essay. You need to dominate your topic in your conclusion. Like I mentioned, finish strong and leave an impression. The final writing problem I faced was writing the perfect thesis statement that can set my paper to be effective. When we began writing the argumentative essay, the first step was to formulate a thesis. It's important to have a thesis that provides you with an abundant amount of writing topics, but not too broad, because if it's too broad, that weakens your overall argument. My first thesis statement for my argument paper was, economic justice in Chicago is mainly threatened by CPS school closings and a lack of funding for public education in the city, which leads to increasing poverty, gang violence, and wealth disparities. One writing tip that I found useful was to formulate a broad thesis based on the assignment, then find as much information as possible. It's okay, especially in the early stages of the essay, not to stick to the thesis. I edited my thesis multiple times before turning in my final paper. At first, my thesis was too specific. I couldn't find any information for it, so I found all my sources and began writing. Then once I got the main idea of the paper, I finalized the thesis. In a couple sentences that umbrellas the whole essay, I ended up with social and economic justice in Chicago is mainly threatened by Chicago public school closings and a substandard education standards. So don't forget to usually leave the thesis for last, but try to stick to a general idea. As a final note, I'd just like to tell you that not everything you write is going to be perfect, so don't be difficult when accepting suggestions for your writing. Regardless of who suggests it, don't be reluctant to think about their edits. It's meant to help you. Also, don't feel overwhelmed by all of your classes, especially not English 160. Professor Clark always gives a reasonable amount of time to work on essays. Yes, they're back to back, but Professor Clark will always offer support if you ask for it. Don't be scared to reach out for help. I myself had a few after-class discussions with Mr. Clark about my essays and left class with a clear idea of how to improve. And on that note, goodbye.